Hey, it's John Reed. Look who I got on the couch at SAP Tech at 2015 Vegas. I got Geoff Scott, CEO of ASUG. How's it going?
It's like a psychology session, isn't it? And I love the Fern. You and I were talking a few minutes ago.
This is Millie.
Millie or Fern. Yeah. I feel like this is an episode of Between Two Ferns.
Yeah. Well, you've been in a chippy mood today, so I'm hoping that's going to translate to it.
I'm going to go completely cold on you as we start.
I'm going to try
today.
to get you to go completely off talking points, and let's see how we do. So we've had.
I'm going to regret this. I'm really going to regret this.
So we've had two keynotes so far. We had Steve Lucas last night. We had Brent Leichert today, and the gist of the keynotes wasn't really so much about S/4HANA. It was really more about sort of the digital enterprise, I guess you could say, and digital change and customer engagement. And I think you're pretty familiar with SAP's products, announcements, and messaging around that. What are your reactions?
So about 2-3 weeks ago, we had members of the ASUG board in Waldorf talking about digital transformation, and we spent a day with Bernd and that group on digital transformation. But we did something really interesting the day before. We just took the ASUG board members, people like Under Armour and Eastman Chemical and Cintas, and we just amongst ourselves talked about digital transformation and how they thought about it. And what was interesting about that conversation was everyone is approaching the problem in a different way, but everyone sees it as a tremendous opportunity, as something that is real and something that is happening. And all of them see SAP and their SAP ecosystems as core to that transformation. So in many ways, in order for their organizations to transform and think about themselves in these digital worlds, they really have to think about how does that core SAP asset transition with them, right? So the conversations about, S/4HANA, the conversations about HANA as a platform, the conversations about Fiori as a new user experience, all weave into that because that happens to be how you start that digital transformation. And I'm just in the middle of reading a book called Vaporized. And for those who haven't, it just came out. It's gotten great reviews. And it really talks about kind of how all of these industries are pivoting and how things have changed, right? And you think about the music industry and going from vinyl records to iTunes and downloads and now to services like Pandora and Spotify, where you pay a monthly fee and you get access to millions and millions and millions of music of of different titles. And I don't want to get into an argument about whether that's the right model, but if you think about it in general and the strategies behind it, an Apple computer buying Beats because it wants access to that library, right? And understanding that even their own iTunes library is quickly becoming outdated because people aren't downloading anymore. And so you say, well, that's the music industry. But I don't think Sam Goody or Tower Records 5-10 years ago thought they'd go out of business, that digital transformation would hit their shores as hard as it did. But if you think about every single one of these industries, and we are all in a very different industry. I think about food, or you think about automotive, or you think about consumer electronics. All of this is pivoting around you, whether you want it to happen or not. It's there, and it's this core SAP asset that has to pivot with you, and it has to carry you through this whole next, iteration of this. So I think the conversation is real, and it's one that you're going to see both us and the German user group DSAG. We're going to talk about this a lot in the next couple months and into next year, and we're actually in the process of thinking about how we want to present this to our joint audiences. So we're actually doing some collaborative work together to think through what does digital transformation mean to members of both user communities.
Right. And so from SAP's standpoint, sort of good news in the sense that, yes, customers are finding digital change is real and important, and that SAP does fit into their view of that.
Right.
But what do they need from SAP to make that happen? Are you starting to figure that out now?
I think what they need ultimately from SAP is a pivot on the word simplicity. And for us and what our members and the user group community talks about is simple isn't just about taking columns out of a database and taking tables out of a database. Yeah, HANA does that really, really well. It's got to be about how do I get to market faster? How do I get my configuration done in a more efficient way? How do I carve not just hours, but days, weeks, maybe even months off of my development cycles? And the rest of the business is moving at a very different pace than it used to. And there's finally a realization that technology matters, and technology is playing on everyone's doorstep. So the SAP ecosystem, our SAP teams cannot be the last ones to the table who go, I've got this great idea, I want to go in this new direction with the business. That would be great, but it's going to take us 6 months and millions of dollars to make that change in SAP. That can't be the go-to answer. And so we have have to figure out simplicity for me and for the ASUG user community is get us these tools that help us to go at this speed and help us to be able to manage our SAP ecosystems, which by definition are all very complex. I mean, we like to talk about simplicity, but people don't buy SAP software because it's simple. They buy it because they have complex business problems they're trying to solve.
Right.
How do we get that factory moving faster?
In a way, they want sophisticated software implemented easily and simply.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
is a different take
Totally
on simple,
different,
right?
right?
Different, yeah.
But if you're ultimately going to get to innovation and you're going to talk about that, my IT staffs or my technology staffs have to innovate faster, somehow we have to release the burden of maintaining what's already there, right? So somehow we have to be able to take all of that IT work that's happening to keep the machines running and move that and make that simpler to do. So ultimately, I think the world of the configurer of SAP software and amazingly important roles, they have to transform. Some of this has to be done by different people. Otherwise, you can't unleash this innovative capacity. And so if we can't come up with better tools, and HANA is a step in that direction, but I think the whole tool set of SAP has to move along with it.
Right.
Imagine the power if you could say, I need to redo it. And this is, I think, some of the things that S4 talks about that hopefully to me is the ultimate promise of S4. If I literally could reconfigure my general ledger on the fly and not have to make that be a multi-month project, imagine the creative power and what that could unleash inside the organization. And you think about big companies with billions of dollars in revenue and thousands and thousands of employees, right? Reconfigure your GL in a couple of days versus months, that's game changing. And I think ultimately that's the direction, and why S4 is interesting to the user community and why it's interesting to me is if we can really deliver, if SAP can really deliver on that promise, that is huge. And that's why I think people should take a careful look at it, because if we can really innovate on an S4 platform, that's worthwhile.
Yeah. You brought up DSAG. DSAG recently got some PR, which they're kind of good at doing. Have you noticed they like to do that? Regarding an S4HANA customer survey that raised some questions about S4HANA adoption and what they were looking for from SAP, and particularly around cloud views of S4. What were your reactions to all that?
When I read that survey, again, we're working closer with DSAG than we ever have in the past. So there's a great collaborative spirit between both user communities. They come to, ASUG annual conference, Sapphire Now, every year. Last year, we were at their annual conference in Germany. So we're spending more and more time together. I read those results, and I thought in many ways they were very similar to the results we talked about last year when we released the HANA survey, right? Adoption, people are worrying about adoption. They're worrying about business cases, right? Those are the things, and that's a consistent theme. And I think people are asking those questions. Yeah, I believe, but how do I get my other key business stakeholders to believe along with me? How do I make that case to the CFO? How do I make that case to the CEO that this is a worthwhile investment? And we all know that these investment dollars are critical things, right? And there's a lot of, competition and contention going inside most organizations about how to spend those dollars. And CIOs, technology professionals need all the help they can to make those cases.
Right.
And I think DSAG did a great job with that survey. We're going to replay the HANA survey. We're in the process of collecting feedback now. I think we have something in the neighborhood of about 700 to 800 respondents, which is more than we had last year. I would like to get a lot more, and we're looking to do that repeat of the HANA survey to see, has that group moved? Have some of the challenges that we talked about last year, the lack of business cases, have those been resolved, and are people happy with what they're seeing? And we should know that answer before year end.
So looking ahead to these changes that SAP is trying to help customers to solve, in obviously a volatile business environment, how do you see the role of user groups like ASUG and DSAG, and then you think about like the UK user group? How should you guys be working together? Should you be advocating with SAP? More dialogue behind the scenes, more public discussions? What do you see your role as?
So I think that the three pillars of ASUG or DSAG or the UK Ireland user group, right? Networking, education, and influence. Those are the three consistent pillars. And our job, the SAP ecosystem is tremendously complex, right? And so everything that we can do from a user group perspective to help people make sense of all of this, to provide perspective, to be able to say, here's what you should do, here's how you should be thinking about these things, is steps in the right direction. I think that ultimately that peer-to-peer conversation, so not just listening to SAP and just listening and saying, okay, SAP, I understand, but also having those critical conversations with your peer group and saying, well, you know, John, you work for so-and-so organization. How are you implementing XYZ technology? How might the rest of the people in North America be doing it? How might DSAG be doing it? And I think you look at DSAG or us and all the user groups, these are not just local country organizations. These are largely global communities, right? I mean, we have a huge global audience inside of ASUG because we service a tremendous amount of global, companies. ASUG is growing. We've had stronger revenues and stronger membership participation this year than we've had in years past.
Yeah.
So, I think we're absolutely doing the right thing. I think one of the criticisms of ASUG, and I take this criticism and I think about it a lot, is, we are not the user group that's going to go out into the public media and say, SAP, you're doing this wrong, you should do this or that. We tend to have a lot of those conversations between us and SAP. We don't do them in the press, and we get criticized for that. But I think my job at the end of the day is to influence SAP in the right direction, not to necessarily put everything out in the public display. And so I spend a tremendous amount of time talking with our member companies, understanding their needs, and then we take that back to SAP and we say, how are you doing this? How are you doing that? How do you make that better? Right. And I think those are, to me, the voice of ASUG, the voice of DSAG are incredibly important. And they're incredibly important to SAP because I know when I have a question and a member has a question, I can send an email to a Bernd Leukert, or I can send an email to a Steve Lucas, and I'll have an answer back in a day or two, or I'll know those people to talk to. And those are critical, relationships to have. And we treat them very seriously, right? I don't want to have a contentious relationship with SAP people. I want to be able to have a positive relationship, and they listen to that, and they're thankful that we do it that way.
That makes sense. We've already run way over time, but there is just one other piece. In it all, I hear what you're saying, and to me, I think back to the enterprise support sort of controversy days where the user groups were, in my mind, more closely aligned around a particular cause.
Yeah.
But then it's felt like a little bit of dissipation of momentum around that. And I see a lot of times more sort of isolated user group activity. And to me, if the major user groups were working more closely together, that would give you a real platform. For example, these issues that SAP struggles with around should existing customers get maintenance credits, for example, because you essentially funded S/4HANA development? Should that result in discounts? I think that's an important issue, and I think it takes all the user groups, in my opinion, together to exist to sort of exert to SAP, hey, this matters to us. Someone brought that up in the BI side too. It's like, well, we funded all these BI solutions. Do we get a credit against Cloud for Analytics? I'm sorry, but I think that's a legitimate question.
I think it's a very fair question, right? And I think my only hesitancy about answering that question is the answers to that are highly complex, right? Because unfortunately, we are not in an environment where SAP has open pricing, where everyone understands what they're paying, the discounts that are involved, right? And so
a lot of this gets handled on a one-to-one basis.
And I think that's terribly inefficient, right? And I think we could do a lot better, but wading into some of those waters, and I think when you talk about the maintenance cost increase of a few years ago, right? That was a clear lightning rod. It was a very easy issue to rally around. I have monthly update calls. I talk to some of my DSAG counterparts on a weekly basis. Finding that same lightning rod is not as easy these days, right? And we can all argue about pricing. And John, I think you make a really good point. And I think we could do better in that regard, but it's almost like, wow, where do you even begin unraveling that conversation? And for a fact that SAP will not help with that, right? No. There's no incentive for them to say, you know what, ASUG, DSAG, we're going to help you figure this out. Right. So, here's my litmus test. When I get together with the 13 board members for ASUG, I listen to them very closely. And these are all leading organizations, huge adopters of SAP technology. The pricing issues are not top of their mind. Right. And they don't talk about that as their number one concern. Their number one concerns are, where is all this technology going? Should I be implementing HANA? How do I implement HANA? How do I implement S4? What does digital transformation mean to me? How do I figure out, and they're all running complex IT portfolios, right? Yes, SAP is a part, and depending on the size of the organization, SAP is a part of that portfolio. It may be 50%, 60%, it may be 30%, right? So how do they figure all of that into their long-term strategy and planning? And that's what I find interesting. And when you get those board members together, or you go to a networking reception and you hear those conversations, that's what they're talking about.
Great. Well, I'm glad those conversations are at least happening with user groups, and I'm very glad you're willing to come on camera and
Anytime.
put some of this in the public domain, because I think people really like to hear this kind of stuff. And honestly, you don't hear these kinds of conversations very often. So.
No, you don't. And I'm happy, as you know, I mean, you've been on our cameras.
Oh.
I'm always happy to return the favor and talk to you through this, Fern. You've been very kind.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you.
for joining us.
Thanks, John.